The only man who could save her family was also the most dangerous man she'd ever met. Maren Cole had no way out. The two foster siblings she'd raised since childhood were about to be separated for good. She'd lost her job, lost her home, lost everything. Then one night, Reed Calloway walked into the bar where she worked. He didn't order a drink. He made her an offer: marry him, take care of his 2 children, and when the contract ends, she walks away with $500,000. It sounded like a way out, until she discovered who her husband on paper really was, and that the people who wanted to destroy him were willing to go through her to get to him. If this story kept you until the very end, hit that like button so more people can hear it. Share it with someone who needs a story worth thinking about, and subscribe so you never miss the next one. The wedding ended at 9 o'clock that night. There was no reception. No guests beyond the 2 witnesses arranged by Reed's lawyer. A 15-minute signing at City Hall. Then a black car brought them back to the penthouse on the 40th floor on Michigan Avenue. The elevator doors opened, and Maren stepped into the apartment that would be her home for the next 12 months. The space was wide, so quiet she could hear the wind against the glass. Reed walked straight to the bar in the corner of the living room, poured himself a glass of whiskey, didn't ask if she wanted anything. He stood with his back to her, loosened his tie, took a long drink, then turned to look at her. His gaze wasn't cold, but it wasn't warm either. It was the way someone looks at a contract that has just been signed. "There are a few things you need to know," Reed said, his voice low and even unhurried. "Your room is at the end of the hallway on the right. Mine is on the left. You don't go into my room. I don't go into yours. The children are downstairs with the nanny. You'll meet them in the morning." Maren stood in the middle of the living room, still wearing the white dress she had borrowed from a second-hand shop on Clark Street. She nodded once. "When we go out," Reed continued, "you appear with me at the events I require. You smile at the right time. You speak when it's appropriate, and you don't ask about my work. Whatever you see or hear in this house, you keep it to yourself." "And the children?" Maren asked. "You take care of them. School runs, meals, homework. That's why you're here." "That's not the only reason," Maren said. "There's also the court." Reed paused. The glass lifted halfway, then lowered again. "My lawyer says a complete family has a better chance in front of a judge. You're that complete part." "So, what am I in this house?" Maren asked. She didn't raise her voice. There was no bitterness. It was just a direct question, because she needed to know where she stood. Reed looked at her. 1 second. 2. "You're the only one who agreed." The answer fell between them like something heavy neither of them wanted to pick up. "The contract lasts 12 months, Reed went on, his voice returning to its usual tone, as if nothing had just happened. "After that, you get paid, you leave, clean. And if I break the contract, you get nothing, and I don't help you with anything else." Maren knew exactly what anything else meant. It meant the 2 younger siblings she had been raising since they were small. It meant the 6-month deadline the social services office had given her, that if she couldn't prove financial stability to gain custody, they would be placed with another family. It meant everything she had held together for the past 3 years would slip from her hands in a single night. Reed set the glass down on the bar. "Any questions?" There were many, but Maren only shook her head. "Good." Reed walked toward the hallway on the left. His steps were steady, and he didn't look back. The door to his room closed softly, and Maren stood alone in the vast living room. She didn't cry. She had given up that habit a long time ago. Maren took off her shoes, her bare feet touching the cold floor, and walked toward the glass wall overlooking the city. Chicago stretched out beneath her, millions of lights scattered like salt across a black cloth. She sat down on the floor, her back against the glass, her head resting on her drawn-up knees. This was her wedding night. No flowers, no music. No one holding her and telling her everything would be all right. Only a 60-page contract. A man who had just locked his bedroom door, and the familiar feeling of loneliness she had once thought had already hardened into something she couldn't feel anymore. Maren closed her eyes. She thought about the 2 kids out there somewhere. She thought about the voice of the social worker from the day before. Cold and professional. 6 months. "Miss Cole, if nothing changes, we have to consider other options." Other options meant separating them. The older one to one place, the younger to another, and everything Maren had built would disappear as if it had never existed. She opened her eyes, looked at the city beneath her, then looked back at the room behind her, wide and empty and not hers. It didn't matter. Maren had lived through worse than this. She had lived through nights without even a blanket, through temporary houses she was never allowed to call home, through the feeling of standing outside a window, watching other people live, and knowing she didn't belong anywhere. A cold man locking his bedroom door wasn't the hardest thing she had ever faced. Maren stood up, picked up her shoes, and walked toward the hallway on the right. She didn't look back at the living room. She didn't need to like this place. She only needed to survive 12 months. And Maren Cole was very good at surviving. Maren woke at 5 o'clock in the morning because of voices outside. Not loud, but clear enough in the silence of the penthouse. She opened her bedroom door, walked down the hall, and stopped when she saw Reed study through the frosted glass. 3 men sat across from him. Reed was at the head of the table, his hands clasped in front of him, his back resting against the chair. He listened more than he spoke, but when he opened his mouth, with just one short sentence, all 3 men nodded almost at the same time. One of them placed a thick envelope on the table. Reed didn't look down, didn't touch it. He only gave a slight nod, and the meeting ended. The 3 men stood, shook hands, then left through a side door Maren hadn't known existed. She stood there for a few more seconds, looking at Reed alone in the room. He sat still, his hands still clasped, his eyes fixed on the envelope on the table. But he didn't open it. Then he stood and walked toward the kitchen without glancing into the hallway, not knowing she was standing there, or knowing and not caring. Maren turned back to her room. There was something in the way those 3 men had nodded that unsettled her. It wasn't the kind of nod business partners gave. It was the kind of nod people gave when they had no other choice. There was a knock at the door at 7 o'clock. Maren had just finished changing when a woman in her early 60s stepped in, her back straight as a ruler, her silver hair pinned into a neat bun at the nape of her neck. She didn't knock a second time. "I am Mrs. Blackwell," she said. "I have managed everything in this house since before the current Mr. Calloway took over. You need to know a few rules." It wasn't a question. She didn't wait for Maren to answer. Mrs. Blackwell began walking down the corridor, and Maren understood that she was expected to follow. The woman listed everything quickly and precisely. Breakfast at 7:30. The children eat separately in their rooms before school. Personal mail is left on the table in the sitting room. Never enter Reed's study when the door is closed. Never open the door to strangers for any reason at all. The previous Mrs. Calloway graduated from Vassar, Mrs. Blackwell said, stopping in the middle of the corridor. She spoke 4 languages and ran this house like a professional institution. She turned and looked at Maren, her eyes moving from head to toe and then back again. "What did you do before this?" Maren knew that question wasn't meant to understand her. It was meant to rank her. "I survived," Maren said. "That's a skill too." Mrs. Blackwell didn't reply, but she didn't ask anything further either. She turned away and kept walking, a little faster now, as though Maren's answer was something she had never heard inside this house and didn't know where to place. For the rest of the morning, Maren walked through the penthouse alone, not to tour it, but to understand what exactly she was inside. 2 bodyguards stood watch by the elevator doors, rotating every 8 hours. Small cameras were mounted at every corner of the hallway, at every doorway. Maren counted 7 on this floor alone. The main door had a magnetic lock and a code. The side door the 3 men had used that morning had its own separate magnetic lock. Reed's study had 2 layers of doors, the outer one made of glass, the inner one thick oak. She didn't try to open them. She didn't need to. She understood enough already. This wasn't the home of an ordinary real estate businessman. Ordinary businessmen didn't need bodyguards standing watch 24 hours a day, didn't need cameras at every corner, didn't need thick envelopes placed on tables at 5 o'clock in the morning that no one dared mention. Maren stood in the middle of the sitting room and looked out through the glass. Chicago stretched beneath her, vast and indifferent. She thought about last night, about the way Reed had said, "You were the only one who agreed," in a voice that held no apology at all. She thought about the 3 men from that morning, about the envelope no one opened, about the side door she didn't know led where. Then she thought about the 2 children she would meet tonight, and the 2 children out there waiting for her to come back. 4 children, 1 contract, and a house that, the more she looked at it, resembled a fortress far more than a home. Maren drew in a long breath. Then she went into the kitchen to make coffee. She didn't know what she had just stepped into, but she knew she wasn't allowed to step back out. Mrs. Blackwell took Maren downstairs that afternoon. She knocked once on the children's door, then opened it without waiting, exactly the way she did everything. The room was bright and spacious. with a bookshelf running along the wall and a study desk by the window. The two girls sat in opposite corners like two planets moving in separate orbits. Josie sat on the rug, holding an old teddy bear with worn ears, and looked up when the door opened. Her eyes were round and timid, like a kitten seeing a stranger for the first time. Tessa sat at the desk with a book open in front of her, her eyes lifting to Maren for exactly 1 second before returning to the page. No greeting. Not rude. She simply didn't see the need. "Mrs." Blackwell said. "This is the new Mrs. Calloway." Then she stepped aside, folded her arms, and watched. Maren didn't walk straight to Tessa. She knew that kind of silence. It wasn't hostility. It was a wall that every child built after losing too much. She had built the same wall once. Instead, Maren sat down on the rug beside Josie. "What's this bear's name?" she asked. Josie looked down at the bear, then up at Maren, then down again. "Captain," the little girl said softly. "Captain? That sounds impressive. Has Captain gone anywhere yet?" Josie shook her head. "Captain only stays home. Captain doesn't like going outside. Just like me," Maren said. "I don't like going out much either," Josie smiled. Small, but real. And in the far corner of the room, Tessa turned the page more slowly. Maren didn't push. She sat with Josie for another 10 minutes, listening as the little girl told her about Captain, about how Captain liked strawberry ice cream but didn't like chocolate ice cream, about how Captain was afraid of thunder. Tessa didn't turn to look, but she didn't leave either. Sometimes silence was its own kind of listening. When Maren stood up, she said, "I'll be upstairs if you need anything." Josie nodded. Tessa didn't move. Maren left the room, and Mrs. Blackwell followed behind her without saying a word. But Maren noticed that the woman hadn't made a single cutting remark during those 10 minutes. Maybe even Mrs. Blackwell knew that there were moments when silence mattered. The days that followed moved in a rhythm. Maren quickly came to recognize. She stayed on one side of the penthouse, Reed on the other, and they almost never crossed paths. He left the house before dawn. Maren knew because she heard the elevator at 5 o'clock every morning, steady as a clock. He came home after midnight, and sometimes didn't come home at all. The only communication between them came through short messages on the phone. "Not coming home tonight. There's an event on Saturday. Dress formally. Don't wait up." Maren didn't wait. She poured her time into the children. Every afternoon after school, she went down to Josie and Tessa's room. Josie began to grow used to her, telling Maren about school, about her art teacher, about the painting she was still coloring and hadn't finished yet. Tessa still kept her distance. She was polite, answered when asked, but never started a conversation first. Maren didn't push. She understood that trust wasn't something you could demand. It had to be earned, one day at a time. In the second week, after the children had gone to sleep and the penthouse had sunk into silence, Maren sat alone in her room and called social services. The caseworker answered after 3 rings. Her voice was still cold and professional, just as it had been before. "Miss Cole, your file still hasn't had any new updates. I need to remind you, you have less than 5 months left." Maren tightened her grip on the phone. "I'm arranging it. Arranging isn't the same as completing it, Miss Cole. If the deadline passes without documents proving financial stability and stable housing, we will have to place the children with another family. That's procedure. Procedure. Such a clean word for pulling 2 children away from the only person they called sister." Maren hung up. She sat on the bed and looked out the window. Chicago at night was still blazing with light, as though it had never slept. She thought about Josie with her teddy bear. Captain. About Tessa and the book, whose pages she turned more slowly whenever Maren was in the room. About the 2 little ones out there waiting for her in a temporary home that she knew exactly what it looked like, because she had grown up in places just like it. 4 children needed her. And at the center of it all was a man who shared her address, but had never shared a meal with her. Maren turned off the light, lay down, and closed her eyes. She didn't need Reed to see her. She only needed him to keep the contract long enough for her to save the children waiting for her on both sides of this door. It happened on the 12th night. Maren couldn't sleep. She went into the living room to get some water when she heard Reed's voice on the balcony. The glass door was left slightly open, just enough for the wind to slip through, and just enough for her to hear every word clearly. His voice was low, slow, each word placed down with the weight of stone. "I don't care what problems he is having. Tell him to pay on time. This isn't the first time I've reminded him, and there won't be a third." Silence. Then, if he thinks he can ignore it, then I'll speak to him directly. Arrange it. He ended the call. He stood out on the balcony for a few more seconds. His face turned toward the city. Then he turned back inside and saw Maren. She stood by the kitchen counter, a glass of water in her hand, not hiding, not pretending she had just arrived. They looked at each other. Reed didn't seem surprised. He didn't seem annoyed either. He only looked at her with calm, unreadable eyes. "There are things you don't need to know," he said. "No explanation, no justification, just a statement, clean and final, the way everything Reed said was." Maren set the glass down. "There are things I already know." Reed looked at her for another second. Then he walked past her, into the hallway, and the door to his room closed. Maren stood alone in the kitchen, her heart beating faster than usual, not from fear, but because she had just heard the voice of a man giving an order in a way no one would dare refuse, and that man slept just one hallway away from her. The next morning, Maren helped Mrs. Blackwell check the list of supplies needed for the children. The housekeeper listed items quickly, marking the paper with a red pen, her mouth moving without pause. In the middle of it, when Maren asked about Tessa's tutoring schedule, Mrs. Blackwell stopped. "You don't need to worry about that. Mr. Calloway handles it." "He handles everything?" Maren asked. "Everything," Mrs. Blackwell said. Then she looked out the window, her voice softer, as though she was speaking more to herself than to Maren. "He is like his father. He knows how to keep everyone in their place." The sentence passed lightly, but Maren caught it. Keep everyone in their place. That wasn't how people spoke about a business owner. That was how they spoke about someone who controlled territory. Maren didn't ask anything more. She didn't need to. The pieces were already enough. The 5 o'clock meeting with 3 men who nodded without daring to disagree. The thick envelope no one mentioned. 2 bodyguards standing watch 24 hours a day, and 7 cameras on just one floor. The side door leading somewhere she wasn't allowed to know. The voice on the balcony the night before, cold and certain. The voice of someone used to giving ultimatums. And now, Mrs. Blackwell's remark. Whether intentional or not, Maren didn't know what Reed Calloway was. She didn't have an exact name for it. But she knew he wasn't a simple real estate businessman. She knew this penthouse wasn't a home. It was a command center. And she knew she was living under the same roof as a man who, when he spoke, no one dared to say no. That night, Maren lay on her bed, staring at the ceiling, and thought, she should leave. The survival instinct she had trained since childhood screamed in her mind that she should pack her things, step into the elevator, and never come back. But then what? The contract would break. There would be no money. The 2 younger ones out there would be moved to another family before she could find a new job. And Josie and Tessa here, 2 children she had only just begun to reach, would lose one more person who walked out of their lives without looking back. Reed hadn't done anything dangerous to her. He was cold, distant, and clearly hiding an entire world behind the door of his study. But he had never threatened her, never forced her to do anything beyond what was written in the contract. And every night, no matter how late he came home, he still paused in front of the children's room. Maren knew because she heard his footsteps in the hallway, slowing at that exact spot, stopping for a few seconds, then moving on. He didn't go in, but he stopped. Maren closed her eyes. She had made her decision. She would stay. Not because of Reed, not because of the money, but because 4 children needed someone who chose not to leave, and she would be that person, no matter what this house truly was. 3 weeks. 21 days Maren had lived in the penthouse without sitting at the same dining table with Reed Calloway even once. 21 days of caring for his 2 children, tidying the life he left behind him, smiling for cameras at a charity event where he needed her to appear, then returning to the room at the far end of the hallway on the right and closing the door behind her. 21 days, and she had reached her limit. That night, Maren waited until the penthouse had gone completely still. The children were asleep. Mrs. Blackwell had gone home. The bodyguards had finished changing shifts. She heard the elevator at 11:45, the familiar footsteps along the hallway, then the light slipping through the crack beneath the study door. He was in there. Maren pushed the door open and walked in without knocking. Reed looked up from the laptop screen, not surprised, not annoyed. He only looked at her with those familiar eyes that never let anyone read anything. "It's late," he said. "I know. What do you need?" "I need you to listen to me." Reed leaned back in his chair, his hands clasped in front of his chest. He didn't invite her to sit, but he didn't send her away either. That was all the permission Maren needed. "The children need their father," she said. "Not money, not a nanny, not a penthouse and private schools and everything money can buy. They need you." Reed didn't answer at once. He looked at her, and for the first time Maren saw something move behind the mask of calm. Not much, just a blink that lasted longer than usual, a breath drawn a little deeper. "You think I don't know that?" he asked, his voice lower now. "I think you do know, but knowing and doing are two different things. Josie draws pictures every day and tapes them to the wall. Do you know that? Tessa finished 3 books this week. Do you know that? Do you even know when the last time was that you spoke to your children?" Silence, heavy and thick. Reed stood up, slowly, not suddenly, not angrily. He came around the desk, stopped a few steps away from Maren, and looked straight into her eyes. "The last time I let someone get close," he said, his voice no louder than a whisper. "That person was gone. Do you want to hear more?" Maren didn't step back. She didn't step forward either. She only stood there, looking at him, and saw something she hadn't expected. Not contempt, not coldness, but pain, pressed down deep, hidden carefully, but still there, just beneath the skin he had spent so long building over himself. "I'm not her," Maren said. Reed looked at her for one long second more. Then he said, slowly, "That's right. She had a choice. You don't." That sentence should have made her angry. And it did make her angry, but not because of the insult, because of the truth behind it. Reed was saying that Noelle, his wife, the woman he had lost, had chosen to stay beside him even knowing the danger, and she had paid for it. Maren, on the other hand, had no choice. She was here because she had been driven into a corner, not because she wanted to be, and Reed believed that would keep her safer, because a person who didn't love had nothing to lose by walking away. "You're wrong," Maren said, but Reed had already turned his back. He walked toward the door, stopped for a second, his hand touching the doorframe. He didn't look back. "Go to sleep, Maren." Then he left. His footsteps were even, his back straight, as though the conversation that had just happened had never happened at all. Maren stood alone in Reed's study, listening to the door of his room close at the far end of the hallway on the left. She was angry, her hands clenched, her jaw tight, a pulse jumping at her temple. But mixed into the anger was something else. Understanding. Maren had lived among all kinds of people. She knew the difference between someone cold by nature and someone cold because of damage. Reed didn't despise her. He didn't hate the children. He stopped outside their bedroom door every night, even if he never walked in. He knew Josie drew pictures and Tessa read books. Maren was sure he knew, because nothing happened in this house that Reed Calloway didn't know about. He simply didn't dare come closer, because the last time he had come close to someone, that person had been taken from him. Maren turned off the light in the study, closed the door, and went back to her room. She wasn't angry anymore, or maybe she still was, but the anger had changed shape. It was no longer aimed at Reed. It was aimed at whatever had taken his wife from him and turned him into a walking shell inside his own penthouse. Maren needed to know what had happened, not because of curiosity, but because she couldn't fight what she didn't understand. And Maren Cole never stopped fighting. Maren waited until noon the next day, when the children were at school and Reed had already left the penthouse at dawn. She found Mrs. Blackwell in the laundry room, where the woman was folding bed linens with a kind of precision that felt almost military. "I need you to tell me about Noelle," Maren said. No circling around it, no careful lead-in. Mrs. Blackwell stopped what she was doing. She didn't look up right away. She finished folding the sheet, placed it down, smoothed the corner flat, and only then turned toward Maren. "That isn't my story to tell, but no one else is going to tell me. Reed won't speak, and I can't live in this house without understanding why it is the way it is." "Mrs.?" Blackwell looked at her. For a long time, as though she was deciding whether Maren deserved to hear it. Then she pulled out a chair and sat down, and for the first time since they had met, she looked like an ordinary person instead of a machine built to run a household. "Noelle Holt," she began, her voice soft but clear. "Daughter of the Holt family, old money from the North Shore. She met Mr. Calloway when he was 26. She married him a year later. She knew who he was, knew what his work was, and she still chose to stay." Mrs. Blackwell paused, breathed in. 3 years ago, there was an incident. It was aimed at Mr. Calloway, but he wasn't the one who was hit. Silence. Marin didn't ask for details. She didn't need them. Noel died on the spot, in his arms. Mrs. Blackwell said that sentence the way someone might read a line from an official report, flat and stripped of emotion, but her hand tightened around the edge of the table. After that night, he changed. Not slowly, immediately, as though someone had switched something off inside him. He didn't cry, didn't speak, didn't come out of his study for a week. And when he did come out, he was a different man. Colder, farther away. He buried Noel, and then he buried everything inside himself that could still make him feel anything at all. Including the children? Marin said softly. Mrs. Blackwell nodded. He didn't abandon them. He still took care of everything. School, doctors, clothes, nannies. But he didn't stay close, didn't hold them, didn't read to them before bed, didn't do any of the things an ordinary father would do, because he believes that anyone who gets too close to him will be hurt. Marin sat still. The last pieces fell into place. Reed hadn't married her because he needed a wife. He had married her because his lawyer had told him he had to. Mrs. Holt, Noel's mother, has been suing for custody of the girls since last year, Mrs. Blackwell continued. She says Mr. Calloway is dangerous, unfit to be a father, that his world took her daughter from her, and she won't let it take her 2 granddaughters as well. The lawyers said that if he couldn't prove he had a stable family life, the judge might lean toward Mrs. Holt. And I am that proof, Marin said. It wasn't a question. You are the only missing part, Mrs. Blackwell said. A mother, on paper. Marin stood up, walked to the window, looked outside without really seeing anything. Now she understood the whole picture. Reed Calloway had lost his wife to the very world he had built. He saw himself as the one who had killed her, not with his hands, but with his existence. And now he was losing his 2 children as well, not because someone was taking them by force, but because he didn't dare come close enough to hold on to them. She wasn't his wife. She was his legal shield. A name on a marriage certificate for a judge to look at and see a complete family. A piece on the board in the game Reed was playing to keep custody of children he didn't even dare truly parent. Marin should have been angry. Maybe she was angry, but stronger than the anger was the familiar exhaustion of someone who had spent too much of her life being used. And stronger than the exhaustion was one question. If Reed couldn't fight for the children, then who would? Marin turned and looked at Mrs. Blackwell. The housekeeper was still sitting there, both hands resting on her lap, waiting. Thank you for telling me, Marin said. Mrs. Blackwell nodded. Then she said, so softly Marin almost didn't hear it, You're the first person who asked. Marin didn't answer. She left the laundry room, walked down the hallway, and stopped outside the children's room. Inside, everything was quiet. They were at school. But Marin still stood there, her hand resting against the wood, and thought about the 4 children her life now revolved around. 2 in this room, 2 out there, and all of them needed someone to choose to stay. Marin lowered her hand. She wasn't going anywhere. The sound of knocking woke Marin at 4 o'clock in the morning. Not the polite kind. Urgent. She opened the door and saw Mrs. Blackwell standing there, coat thrown on in haste, hair not yet pinned, looking imperfect for the first time. The older girl has had a high fever since midnight, she said. The nanny called me. I have already called Dr. Fan. He is on his way. Marin didn't ask anything more. She put on a coat, walked into the living room, and saw that Reed was already there. He stood by the window, his back turned, both hands in his pockets, still wearing the same dark suit from the night before, which meant he hadn't slept, or had only just returned. He didn't turn when he heard Marin's footsteps. You already know? Marin asked. Mrs. Blackwell called me first, he said, his voice flat. Nothing more. They stood there, 2 people at opposite ends of the living room, waiting for the doctor in silence. Marin looked at Reed's back. He stood straight, unmoving, like a statue. But she saw his right hand inside his pocket clenched so tightly that the fabric wrinkled. 20 minutes later, the elevator opened. Dr. Fan stepped out, a small man with an old leather bag and round-framed glasses. He nodded to Reed, nodded to Marin, then went straight into the older girl's room without a word. Marin wanted to follow, wanted to go inside, sit by the bed, check if the girl's breathing was steady, but she stopped at the door. Let the doctor work. 15 minutes passed. 20. 30. Reed still stood by the window, not moving a single step. Mrs. Blackwell made tea and set it on the table. No one touched it. Finally, Dr. Fan opened the door and came out. He didn't look at Reed. He looked at Marin. That said more than any diagnosis. Acute myocarditis, he said, his voice low and slow. A complication after the flu last week. Her heart is beating irregularly, arrhythmic. How serious is it? Marin asked. Serious. Normally I would transfer her to the hospital immediately, but she is too weak. Moving her right now could make things worse. Then what do you do? Reed said from the window. His voice was still flat. But Marin heard something cracking underneath. Dr. Fan turned to him. I have given medication to stabilize her heart rhythm and reduce the fever. I will stay and monitor her through the night. But Mr. Calloway, I need you to understand. This is not an ordinary illness. Her heart is under significant strain. Silence. Then Reed said, Call my sister. Tell her to prepare a room. I want the child moved there tonight. Marin turned sharply toward him. No. Reed looked at her for the first time since she had entered the living room. That isn't your decision. The child lost her mother 3 years ago. You want to take her away from her home, away from her sister, at a time like this? I want her safe. Safe? Marin stepped forward. Or do you want her far enough away that you don't have to see her afraid? The question hung in the air. Mrs. Blackwell stood by the kitchen counter, motionless. Dr. Fan looked down at the floor. Reed looked at Marin, his jaw tight, his eyes hardening. 1 second, 2 seconds. Then he turned his face away. He didn't speak, didn't give the order. The child wasn't sent anywhere. Mrs. Blackwell quietly arranged for the girl to be moved to a separate room on the other side of the penthouse, away from any tension. She didn't need to be told. She had lived in this house long enough to know when to act without waiting for instructions. Dr. Fan went back into the patient's room, but he pulled Marin aside before closing the door. He spoke softly, only loud enough for the two of them to hear. Mrs. Calloway, I will do everything within my ability. But her heart is very weak. The medication can control the symptoms, but it can't cure the cause. If her condition doesn't improve within the next 24 hours. He stopped. You should prepare yourself. Marin looked straight into his eyes. I am not preparing for that outcome, doctor. Dr. Fan studied her for another second, then nodded. Not because he believed her, but because he saw something in Marin that he didn't want to stand in the way of. He went back into the room and closed the door. Marin stood in the hallway. On one side, Dr. Fan was caring for a child she had known for less than a month. Behind her, Reed stood by the window, facing the darkness inside himself. And somewhere in this penthouse, the younger girl was sleeping with her teddy bear captain, unaware that her world was trembling. Marin leaned back against the wall, closed her eyes, and told herself that she would not lose anyone else. Not tonight. Not in this house. Marin didn't go into the room. She sat in the hallway instead, her back against the wall, her legs stretched out across the cold floor. Behind the closed door, Dr. Fan monitored every heartbeat, every number on the screen of the monitor. Now and then Marin heard the steady beeping drifting out, and every time the sound slowed or quickened, she held her breath. Then it would return to normal, and she would breathe again, over and over like that, for hours. The penthouse was so quiet that Marin could hear the wind slipping through the crack of a window at the far end of the hallway. Mrs. Blackwell had gone to lie down after Marin insisted that she rest. The younger child was asleep in the room on the other side, safe and knowing nothing. And Reed wasn't here. Not until 2 o'clock in the morning. Marin heard his footsteps before she saw him. Slow, not the kind of deliberate stride she had grown used to hearing every morning before dawn. This was the walk of a man who didn't know where he was going. Reed appeared at the far end of the hallway. His jacket was off, the sleeves of his shirt rolled to his elbows, his hair pushed into disarray. He saw Marin sitting on the floor and stopped. 1 second, 2 seconds. Then he came forward and, without saying a word, sat down beside her, his back against the same wall, his legs stretched out across the same floor, less than an arm's length away from her. It was the first time they had been this close without arguing. Neither of them spoke. The beeping from inside the room came out in a steady rhythm, and Marin counted along with it. 1, 2, 3. Still steady. Still all right. Then Reed spoke. He didn't look at her. His eyes stayed fixed on the opposite wall, his voice so low that Maren had to lean a little closer to hear. That night, he said, everything happened very fast. I didn't react in time. Didn't do anything in time. By the time I looked down, Noelle was already there. In my arms. He stopped, swallowed. I kept the dress shirt she was wearing that night. Kept it for 3 days without changing. Didn't wash it. Didn't let it go. As though if I let go of it, then she would be truly gone. Completely. Forever. Maren didn't move. Didn't touch him. Didn't say I understand or I am sorry or any of the things people usually said when they didn't know what else to say. She simply sat there and listened, because sometimes that was the only thing a person needed. Mrs. Blackwell was the one who pulled that shirt out of my hands on the 4th day, Reed said, almost with a bitter laugh. She told me that if I didn't bathe, she would call an ambulance. I bathed. Then I went into my study. Locked the door. Stayed in there for a week. He turned to look at Maren for the first time. His eyes weren't red. They weren't wet. But something behind them had broken long ago, and he had never let anyone see it. If I lose one more person, he said, his voice so quiet it nearly vanished, I won't be able to get back up. Maren looked at him for a long time. Looked at the man no one in Chicago dared confront, sitting on the hallway floor at 2 o'clock in the morning, telling her that he was afraid, not afraid of enemies, not afraid of losing money or power, but afraid of losing one more person he loved. She could have comforted him, could have said that everything would be all right, that the girl would recover, that he was strong enough to survive it. But Maren never said things she didn't know for certain. Then don't lose her, she said. Her voice wasn't soft, wasn't gentle. It was direct and hard and real, like everything about Maren. Get up and fight. Reed looked at her. For a long time, as though he was searching for something in her eyes that he hadn't found in anyone in the past 3 years. Maren didn't know whether he found it, but he didn't turn away, didn't stand up and go back to his room, didn't shut the door the way he always had before. He stayed there, beside her, on the cold floor, in the dark hallway, with the beeping of the monitor coming through the door. And for the first time since Maren had stepped into this penthouse, the distance between them wasn't as wide as the whole city below anymore. It had narrowed, by only 1 step. Small, but enough. They had been sitting there for less than an hour when the alarm blared. Not a fire alarm. A short, urgent sound, repeating over and over, echoing through the penthouse. Reed was on his feet before Maren could react. His phone was already at his ear. He listened, his eyes narrowing, his jaw tightening. Then he ended the call. Someone breached the basement level, he said. No panic, no raised voice. Just a statement, like reading the weather. But his eyes were different. His eyes were calculating. He turned to Maren. Stay here. Lock the penthouse door after I leave. Don't open it for anyone except me or Mrs. Blackwell. If anything happens, the safe room is behind the bookshelf in the living room. The code is 0917. Maren looked at him. Whose birthday? Reed paused. Just 1 beat. The day Noelle died. Then he was gone. His steps quick and decisive. His phone already back to his ear as he called someone else. His voice low and sharp. The elevator opened, closed, and Maren stood alone in the hallway. The alarm had stopped. Someone on the security team had handled the system, but the silence afterward felt heavier than the noise. Maren locked the penthouse door, checked everything. The younger child was still asleep in the room across the hall, Mrs. Blackwell lying beside her. Safe. She returned to the hallway and sat down in her old place outside the sick room door. Her heart was beating fast, but her hands stayed steady. She had lived through enough to know that panic didn't save anyone. Then the door opened. Dr. Fan stepped out, his face gray. Her heart is weakening, he said. The medication to stabilize her rhythm isn't enough anymore. The arrhythmia is getting worse. What can you do? With what I have here, not much. She needs a specialized hospital, but moving her now isn't possible, Maren said. Then there has to be another way. Dr. Fan shook his head. Mrs. Calloway, I have tried everything within my ability. Maren closed her eyes, breathed, and in the darkness behind her eyelids, something lit up. Not a miracle, not instinct, memory, 2 years she had worked as an accountant for a pediatric cardiology clinic in the southern part of Boston. Hundreds of insurance claims she had processed. And one case she would never forget, because she had read every piece of medical literature about it to write an appeal when the insurance company refused coverage. A 10-year-old child. Myocarditis. Heart on the verge of stopping. The treatment. IVIG. Intravenous immunoglobulin. The insurance company said there wasn't enough evidence. Marin had written a 17-page appeal, citing every study, every clinical data point. The insurance company approved it. The child lived. IVIG, Marin said, opening her eyes. Dr. Fan looked at her. What? Intravenous immunoglobulin. High dose. There are studies showing it can be effective for acute myocarditis when standard treatments fail. You're not a doctor, Dr. Fan said, his voice sharper than she expected. And you're running out of options. The words hung between them. Dr. Fan looked at her, looked at the door behind him, looked back at her. I have IVIG in my emergency kit, he said slowly. But the dosage for a case like this isn't standardized. If I calculate it wrong, then calculate it right, Marin said. Dr. Fan hesitated for 3 seconds more. Then he went back into the room. Marin sat in the hallway, counting every minute. Through the door she heard Dr. Fan preparing, the tier of medical packaging, the change in the rhythm of the monitor. 10 minutes later, he came out. The first dose is in. No response yet. How long do we wait? 20 minutes. If there's no improvement, then increase the dose, Marin said. Based on weight. She's smaller than average. The first dose might not be enough. Dr. Fan looked at her, half astonished, half afraid. If I increase it and her heart can't take it, is that more dangerous than doing nothing? Marin asked. 20 minutes passed. No improvement. Dr. Fan looked at Marin through the slightly open door. She nodded. He disappeared inside. 10 minutes. 20. 30. Marin sat on the floor, her arms wrapped around her knees, counting her own breaths because there was nothing else left to count. Then the door opened. Dr. Fan stood there, his eyes wider than usual. Her heart is stabilizing, he said. The rhythm is regular. Blood pressure is rising again. Marin couldn't stand. Her legs had no strength left. She sank down onto the floor, her back sliding against the wall, her hands shaking so badly she had to press them against her knees to keep them still. She had just saved a life. With knowledge from a job she had once thought was the most meaningless thing she had ever done. With a 17-page insurance appeal she had written at 2 o'clock in the morning in a rundown office in Boston, for a child she had never even met. It turned out nothing had ever been meaningless at all. Reed returned at nearly 5 o'clock in the morning. Marin heard the elevator first, then the sound of the code lock, then his footsteps. Not the steady footsteps she had grown used to. Heavier, slower, like a man carrying something heavier than flesh. He appeared at the end of the hallway. His shirt was wrinkled, one side untucked from his trousers. His sleeves were still rolled to the elbows from when he had sat with her on the floor a few hours earlier. But now there was a stain on one wrist that Marin didn't ask about. His hair was more disheveled. His eyes were more tired. But he was still standing straight, because Reed Calloway always stood straight, even when everything around him was collapsing. Marin was still sitting on the floor, in the same place, her back against the wall, her legs stretched out, her hands resting on her knees, no longer shaking, though not yet entirely steady. She looked up when he came closer. Reed looked at her, looked at the closed sickroom door behind her. How is she? His voice was rough, like a man who had spoken too much, or shouted too loudly over the past few hours, or both. Alive, Marin said. One word. It was all she had the strength to say, and it was all he needed to hear. Reed stood there for a few more seconds. Then he did something Marin didn't expect. He sat down. Not the way he had the night before. Slowly, and with hesitation. This time he dropped down heavily, as though his legs had finally refused to keep him standing any longer. His back against the wall beside her, closer than before, his shoulder nearly touching hers. They sat in silence. The beeping from the sickroom came through the door. Steady, slow, stable. The most beautiful sound Marin had ever heard. Beyond the glass at the end of the hallway, the Chicago sky was still dark, but the horizon was beginning to pale, deep violet turning to gray, gray turning to silver. Morning was coming. Then Marin felt it. Reed's hand, moving slowly, very slowly, across the floor between them. His fingers touched hers, stopped, as though he was waiting for her to pull away. She didn't. He took her hand, gently. No grip, no tug, just held it. His hand was larger than hers, warmer than she had expected, and rough across the palm. Not the hand of a man who had spent his whole life behind a desk. This was the first time Reed Calloway had touched her since that brief handshake in front of witnesses at City Hall a month earlier. That time had been performance. This wasn't. "You saved my daughter," he said. He didn't look at her. His eyes stayed fixed on the opposite wall, the exact same posture he had worn a few hours earlier when he told her about Noelle. But his voice was different now. No longer the voice of a man speaking about old pain. It was the voice of a man who had just realized he had almost lost someone again, and someone else had held that loss back for him. "I did what anyone would have done," Maren said. Reed turned and looked at her. For the first time in this long night, his eyes weren't flat. Not the familiar wall she had looked at for a month. There was something behind them now, deep and real and wounded. But there was something else, too. Gratitude. Not the polite kind people offered out of courtesy. The kind felt by someone who had nearly drowned and been pulled back up. "No," he said. "No one stays." 3 words. But Maren heard everything he didn't say. No one stayed beside him. No one stayed for the children. No one stayed in this penthouse in the middle of the night, sitting on the cold floor, waiting for a doctor to speak a single word. No one, except her. Maren didn't answer. She didn't need to. There were moments when silence said more than any sentence could. She only tightened her hand around his once, then let it rest. They sat there, said nothing more. The first light of morning slipped through the glass at the end of the hallway, drawing a pale gold line across the floor, slowly reaching toward them. Inside the sick room, the beeping stayed steady, their hands stayed joined. And for the first time since she had stepped into this penthouse, Maren thought that maybe, only maybe, she wasn't completely alone. 2 weeks after that night, everything in the penthouse began to change in small ways that only Maren noticed. Reed still left early, but he came home earlier. No longer after midnight, 10 o'clock, sometimes 9. He still didn't sit down to eat with them, but sometimes he would stop in the kitchen while Maren was washing dishes, stand there for a few seconds as though he wanted to say something, then leave. Small progress. But Maren had learned to measure in small units. The older girl was recovering. Dr. Fan came every day, checked her, nodded, and spoke less. A good sign in a doctor. The younger child had returned to her usual room, drawing pictures and telling stories about Captain to the nanny. The penthouse began to carry laughter again, thin and hesitant, but present. Then Ginevra Holt arrived. No appointment, no call ahead. The security team called up to the penthouse at 3 o'clock in the afternoon. "There is a woman named Holt in the lobby. She says she is the children's grandmother, and she won't leave until she is allowed up." Maren looked at Mrs. Blackwell. The housekeeper stood by the kitchen counter, her face tightening. "That is Ginevra Holt," she said. "Noelle's mother." "Let her up," Maren said. "Mrs." Blackwell looked at her. "Are you sure? I don't hide in my own house." The elevator opened. Ginevra Holt stepped out. A woman in her 50s, back straight, chin lifted, her eyes sweeping across the penthouse as though she was taking inventory of assets. She wore a black wool coat, carried a leather handbag, a string of pearls at her throat. But Maren saw what most people would miss. The inside clasp of the pearl necklace was scratched, the kind of cheap replacement clasp pawn shops used when returning reclaimed items. The diamond earrings had a faint cloudiness at the base, not original settings, pieces that had passed through at least one other hand. 2 years as an accountant had taught Maren that money left traces, and the traces on Ginevra Holt said she was running short of it. "So you are the replacement," Ginevra said. No greeting, no handshake. Her eyes moved over Maren from head to toe, slow and deliberate, the way someone used to measuring people by their background looked at them. "I am Mrs. Calloway," Maren said. "I know who you are." Ginevra sat down on the sofa without being invited. A girl with no home, no profession, raised in the system, and now somehow sitting in my son-in-law's penthouse. "Former son-in-law," Maren said. "Your daughter is gone." Ginevra looked at her. Her eyes blinked once. That was the only reaction. "Yes," she said, her voice colder. "My daughter is gone, because of the man you just married. And now my granddaughters are in this house, under the care of a woman Reed picked up from a bar." What did you come here for, Mrs. Holt? I came to tell you that I will take my granddaughters out of here, by law or by any means necessary. Reed Calloway is a dangerous man. Anyone who stays near him pays the price. My daughter paid. I will not let my granddaughters pay next. What evidence do you have? Marin asked, calm. Evidence? That Reed is dangerous, that the children are not safe. What do you have besides accusations and rumors? Ginevra stood up. I have lawyers. I have connections. I have a voice in this society. And I have the truth that my daughter died because of his world. You have the truth that your daughter chose to stay, Marin said. And you also have a pearl necklace that has been through a pawn shop at least once. Silence. Ginevra stood motionless. Her hand moved unconsciously to her throat, to the exact necklace Marin had just mentioned. Then she dropped her hand quickly, as though burned. I don't know what you are talking about. I think you know very well. Marin stood up and stepped closer, not threatening, not raising her voice, just direct. Do you want your granddaughters, or do you want their trust funds? Ginevra went pale, not slowly, the kind of pale that came from being struck somewhere she hadn't expected. She looked at Marin, her eyes widening, and for the first time since she had stepped into the penthouse, she had no answer. I think this conversation is over, Marin said. Ginevra stood there for 3 seconds more. Then she turned and walked toward the elevator, her back still straight but her steps faster than when she had arrived. She didn't look back. The elevator doors closed. Marin stood in the middle of the living room, listening to her own heart pounding in her chest. She had just confronted Reed Calloway's former mother-in-law, a woman with lawyers, with connections, with the power to tear this family apart piece by piece. And Marin knew, with the same certainty as knowing the sun rose in the east, that Ginevra would return. Not with words, with court papers. This was the real battle. And it had just begun. Ginevra returned 3 days later. This time she didn't come alone. A man in a gray suit walked beside her, a leather briefcase in his hand, his eyes cold and professional. A lawyer. Marin knew it before he had the chance to introduce himself. They sat in the living room, Ginevra in the chair across, the lawyer beside her, and Marin remained standing. She didn't sit. She wasn't giving them that comfort. We will file a petition in family court within 2 weeks, the lawyer said. My client has sufficient grounds to request a transfer of guardianship. On what grounds? Marin asked. Mr. Calloway has a lifestyle unsuitable for raising children. He is frequently absent, has questionable business relationships, and questionable isn't evidence, Marin cut in. The lawyer looked at her. Ginevra looked at her. Marin looked straight at Ginevra. You should know something, Marin said, her voice even. Noelle kept a journal. Ginevra went still. She wrote clearly. She knew who Reed was, knew what his work was, knew the risks, and she chose to stay. Every day, every page. If you take this to court, I will place that journal in front of the judge. The whole world will read your daughter's words saying she loved the man you are trying to destroy. Silence. Ginevra stared at Marin without blinking. The lawyer looked at Ginevra. You're lying, Ginevra said, her voice low. Do you want to test that? Marin asked. 3 seconds. 5 seconds. Ginevra stood up. We're leaving, she said to the lawyer. They stepped into the elevator. The doors closed. But Marin knew this wasn't over. Ginevra had been pushed back, not defeated. She would sue. And once they were in court, the lie about the journal wouldn't hold forever. Marin needed something real. She sat down at the kitchen table, opened her laptop, and began doing what she did best, following the money. At the same time, Reed Calloway sat across from Vito Marchetti in a restaurant in Wicker Park. Marchetti was an old rival, the man who controlled the west side of Chicago, and someone Reed had kept his distance from for 3 years. But Marchetti hadn't kept his distance from Reed. I hear Mrs. Holt is suing you, Marchetti said, turning the glass of wine in his hand. Where you heard that doesn't matter, Reed said. I hear a lot of things. For example, I hear you have a few files a judge would love to see. Files that if Mrs. Holt had in her hands, the case would end very quickly. Reed didn't move. His eyes rested on Marchetti like he was looking at a piece on a board he had already calculated 10 moves ahead. What do you want? Reed asked. The south side. Hand it over. You don't need it. I do. And if I don't? Then I send what I have to Mrs. Holt's lawyer. Simple. Reed looked at Marchetti. Slowly. Then he reached into his inner jacket pocket, took out a thin envelope, and placed it on the table between the two glasses. "Open it," Reed said. Marchetti looked at the envelope, looked at Reed, then opened it. Inside were 3 printed pages. Marchetti read the first page. His expression changed. Not much, but enough. "Illegal transactions through a chain of stores in Lincoln Park," Reed said, his voice low and even. 43 transactions over 18 months. The total amount is enough for the FBI to open a major investigation. And I have names, dates, account numbers. Marchetti set the papers down. His face stayed hard, but his hand trembled slightly. "Where did you get this? That isn't important. What matters is if you touch my family, even by sending a single document to Mrs. Holt. This file goes to the FBI the next morning." Silence. Marchetti looked at Reed. Reed looked back. No one spoke. Finally, Marchetti folded the pages, put them back in the envelope, and pushed it back across the table toward Reed. "Keep your south side," Marchetti said. Then he stood up and walked away. Reed remained seated for another minute, finished his wine, then left the restaurant. By the time he returned to the penthouse, it was nearly 11 at night. The living room was dark, but the kitchen was still lit. Marin sat at the kitchen table, surrounded by files, printed documents, highlighters, and an open laptop. She was reading something, making notes in the margins, her brow furrowed in the yellow light. She looked up when Reed walked in. "Ginevra Holt owes $2.3 million, Marin said. No greeting, no question about where he had been. She has sold her house in the North Shore, sold almost all her jewelry, and is living on credit. The Children's Trust Fund is worth $8 million. If she wins custody, she gains access to it." Reed stood at the kitchen entrance, looking at Marin, looking at the stack of documents, looking back at her, and for the first time, on the face that was always controlled and unreadable, Marin saw something she had never seen before. Not surprise, not gratitude. Recognition. Recognition that the woman sitting in his kitchen at 11 o'clock at night wasn't following a contract. She was fighting. For his family. "You found all this?" he asked. Marin looked at him. "I'm an accountant. Money always leaves a trace." Reed looked at her for a long second more. Then he nodded. Once, slowly, and went to his room without another word. But Marin saw, just before he turned away, the corner of his mouth shift. Not quite a smile, but very close. The knock on Marin's door came close to midnight. Soft. Twice. She was sitting on her bed, reading through Ginevra's financial records again, when she stopped. It wasn't Mrs. Blackwell. She knocked once and came in anyway. It wasn't the nanny. She never came up to this floor at this hour. Marin opened the door. Reed was standing there, and for a second, she almost didn't recognize him. No suit jacket, no watch, none of the armor he wore every day to face the world, just an old t-shirt and lounge pants, barefoot on the wooden floor. He looked like an ordinary man, for the first time. "Marchetti is dealt with," he said. "He won't cause trouble anymore." Marin leaned against the doorframe. "How? You don't need to know." That line again. Reed almost smiled. Almost. "There are things I do to keep this family safe that you wouldn't want to know the details of, but there is something you should know." He paused. Marin waited. "I am trying," he said. His voice was lower than usual. Not the voice he used to give orders. Not the flat, familiar voice she had come to know. It was the voice of a man saying something he wasn't used to saying. "Trying to change. Trying to become worthy of what you're building here." Marin looked at him. Looked at the man who had built walls around himself for 3 years, now standing at her door close to midnight, barefoot, with no weapon except the truth. "I could love you," Marin said. She hadn't planned it, hadn't prepared it. The words stepped out of her mouth before she could stop them, and she didn't want to stop them. "If you stop treating me like a contract." Reed stood still. His eyes searched hers, and Marin saw something tremble in the depths of those gray eyes, something he had buried for 3 years, and that was now clawing its way back to the surface. "I don't know if I still know how to love anyone," he said. Marin took one step closer, close enough to feel the warmth coming from him, but without touching. "Just don't close the door," she said. Reed looked at her, and for the first time since she had stepped into this penthouse, she saw him standing in the doorway instead of on the other side of it. He was weighing whether to step through. Then the phone rang. Not Reed's phone. Marin's. On the bedside table. She turned to pick it up. Dr. Fan's name glowed on the screen. Mrs. Calloway. The doctor's voice was short and urgent. Her heart is arrhythmic again. I need a decision right now. Marin felt the floor tilt beneath her feet. Not for the first time, but this time was different. Because this time she wasn't alone. She turned to look at Reed. He had heard. His eyes changed, that tremor at the bottom of them vanishing, replaced by something harder, sharper. But he didn't turn away, didn't go back to his room, didn't close the door again. He stepped forward, and his hand found hers. This time Marin held on first, held tight, kept him there at the threshold he had almost crossed. This time we save her together, he said. Not a question, a declaration. They walked into the hallway together. Reed took out his phone and called Dr. Fan. His voice was still low, but no longer cold. Do whatever needs to be done. I trust her. Her, not, I trust you, but I trust her, meaning Marin. Dr. Fan understood. I vig a second time. Faster this time. Dr. Fan already knew the procedure, already had the experience from the first round, and Marin didn't need to persuade him. He prepared the dose, calculated it by weight, and started the infusion. Marin and Reed sat outside in the hallway, in the same old place, against the same old wall. But everything else had changed. Reed didn't sit at a distance. He sat beside her, shoulder to shoulder, still holding her hand. 10 minutes, 20. The door opened. Dr. Fan looked at them. Stable, he said. Her rhythm is regular. The heart is responding better than last time. Marin let out a breath. Her whole body softened as though someone had wound her too tight and had finally let the spring go. She leaned her head against the wall, closed her eyes, and felt tears running down her face without knowing when they had started. Then Reed turned toward her. Marin opened her eyes and saw that his were red. Not wet. Reed Calloway didn't cry, but red. Red like a man who had held too much for too long and now couldn't hold it all anymore. He didn't say anything. He didn't need to. He pulled her into his arms, held her, very tightly, for a very long time. His arms wrapped around her back, his face pressed into her hair, and Marin felt his chest shudder. Not with sobbing, with release. 3 years held inside, 3 years of locked doors, 3 years of keeping everything at a safe distance, and now he was letting go. Not all of it, but enough. Marin held him back. Her arms circled his waist, holding on tight, holding him as though if she let go, he would fall, and maybe he really would. They sat there on the hallway floor, holding each other in silence, while behind the closed door, a child was breathing steadily again. And Marin thought, for the first time, not with reason, but with something deeper, that she was no longer here because of a contract. In the weeks that followed, the penthouse turned into a war room. The kitchen table where Marin once sat alone for breakfast was now covered with files, bank statements, and copies of court documents. Marin worked every night, after the children had gone to bed, after Mrs. Blackwell had left, after the penthouse sank into silence. And now she wasn't working alone. Reed sat across from her. Every night, not because she asked, he came on his own, bringing a laptop, a phone, and a cup of black coffee without sugar. They didn't talk much. They didn't need to. Marin handed him what she found. He read, nodded or shook his head, then passed it back. Sometimes he pointed out a detail she had missed. Sometimes she found things his entire legal team hadn't. They worked in sync in a way neither of them had expected. The financial picture of Ginevra Holt came together piece by piece. She owed $2.3 million, mostly in credit card debt and personal loans. The house in the North Shore had been sold 14 months earlier. Jewelry, cars, antiques, gone one by one. She was living in a rented apartment in Gold Coast, paying with borrowed money, and could only hold on for a few more months. Meanwhile, the trust fund Reed had set up for the children after Noelle's death was worth $8 million. If Ginevra gained custody, she would control that fund until the children turned 18. $8 million. That was what Ginevra Holt truly wanted. Marin finished her last note, closed the laptop, and looked over at Reed. He was reading the statement of a witness Ginevra's lawyer intended to bring to court, a former neighbor willing to testify that Reed was an absent father. She'll use everything, Marin said. I know, Reed replied, without looking up. But she doesn't have hard evidence about your work. Marchetti has been neutralized. So all she has is rumors, accusations, and statements from people who don't live in this house. And what do you have? Maren reopened the laptop and turned the screen toward him. Complete financial records proving she's going bankrupt. Medical receipts showing the children are well cared for. Stable school reports. And Dr. Fan's testimony. Reed looked at the screen, then at her. When did you prepare all this? Since the night Ginevra came the first time. He nodded, slowly. Something softened in his eyes. Something Maren had begun to recognize in recent weeks. No longer a wall, a window, slightly open, letting just enough light through. Reed, Maren said. She rested her hand on the table, close to his but not touching. I have 2 younger siblings, out there, in the system. He looked at her, didn't interrupt. I've raised them since they were small. They call me their sister, and if I don't complete the adoption process before the deadline, they'll be moved to another family. Silence. Reed said nothing for 10 seconds. Then he spoke, very quietly. When this case is over, I will help you bring them home. Maren looked at him, searching for signs of politeness, obligation, something empty. She found none. He meant it. Thank you, she said. Don't thank me. You saved my child twice. Bringing 2 children home isn't a favor. It's the obvious thing to do. They sat there a while longer, said nothing more, didn't need to. The distance that once stretched across the entire penthouse had shrunk to the space between 2 cups of coffee on the table. The night before the hearing, Maren couldn't sleep. She sat on her bed, reviewing the files one last time, checking every number, every name, every detail. She had done everything she could, but a courtroom wasn't the kind of battlefield she knew. She wasn't a lawyer. She was an accountant, a girl who had grown up without parents in Boston, a bartender until a man walked into her life and changed everything. A knock at the door. Reed. He stood in the hallway, holding a glass of water, looking at her. You're not sleeping. Neither are you. I'm used to it. He stepped inside, placed the glass on the bedside table, then stood by the window, his back against the wall, looking at her. You're worried? No, that's a lie. Maren looked at him. A little. Reed gave a small nod. You saved my child twice. With knowledge, with instinct, with a stubbornness I haven't seen in anyone. A courtroom won't break you. Maren didn't answer, but she felt the tight knot in her chest loosen a little. The next morning, she put on the only outfit she owned that was formal enough, checked the files one last time, and stepped into the living room. Reed stood by the elevator. He wasn't going with her. Dr. Fan had insisted that someone stay with the older girl, and Reed stayed. Be careful, he said. Ginevra doesn't play clean. Maren stepped into the elevator, turned to look at him. Neither do I. The elevator doors closed. Maren went to court alone, but for the first time, she knew someone was at home waiting for her to come back. The Cook County Federal Family Court opened the hearing at 9 o'clock in the morning. Maren arrived 15 minutes early, sat in the row on the right, her file case resting on her lap, her back straight. She didn't have a lawyer. Reed did, but his lawyer sat in the back only to observe. Before she left, Reed had said, My lawyer will be there, but you speak. You're the one living in that house. You're the one the judge needs to hear. Ginevra sat on the opposite side. She wore black, her hair neatly arranged, her back straight as steel. Her lawyer sat beside her, briefcase already open, papers arranged in order. They looked thoroughly prepared. So did Maren. The judge was a man in his 60s, silver-haired, sharp-eyed. He read through the file in silence for several minutes, then looked up. Mrs. Holt, you filed the petition requesting transfer of guardianship. You may begin. Ginevra's lawyer stood. He spoke clearly, professionally, point by point. Reed Calloway was an absent father. He left early and returned late, rarely spent time at home with the children. He had questionable business associations that many people in certain circles knew about. His wife had died under violent circumstances, and he had remarried in haste to a woman with no experience raising children, clearly only to serve this court proceeding. 2 witnesses were called. One former neighbor said Reed was cold, distant, never seen at the playground with the girls. A former employee said he had once heard Reed speaking on the phone in a threatening voice. Accusations, rumors, subjective impressions. Not one piece of hard evidence. Maren noted every point. Then it was her turn. She stood, took her file case, and walked to the front. not shaking, or maybe shaking, but no one could see it. "Your Honor," Marin said, "I'm not a lawyer. I'm Mr. Calloway's wife and the daily caregiver of the 2 children for the past 3 months. I would like to present what I know, with facts and with numbers." She opened the file case. "These are Mrs. Ginevra Holt's financial records." She placed them on the judge's bench. "Mrs. Holt currently owes $2.3 million. She has sold her house, sold assets, and is now living on borrowed money. The trust fund that Mr. Calloway established for the 2 children is worth $8 million. If Mrs. Holt receives guardianship, she will gain control of that fund." She paused. "I'm not saying Mrs. Holt doesn't love her grandchildren, but I am saying that the financial motive here is clear and verifiable." Ginevra's lawyer rose to object. The judge lifted a hand. "Let Mrs. Calloway continue." Marin placed more papers on the bench. "These are the children's routine medical records. Good health. These are their school reports. Stable. This is the statement from Dr. Fan, the family physician, confirming that the children are being properly cared for and are recovering after a serious illness that I helped him treat." She looked at the judge. The older girl had acute myocarditis. The doctor said he didn't have enough means. I was the one who found the treatment method and persuaded him to try it. The girl lived. Twice. The courtroom fell silent. Ginevra looked down at the table. "Mrs. Holt says, I have no experience raising children," Marin continued, her voice no louder, but heavier now. "She's right. I wasn't trained. I don't have credentials. I grew up in foster care." She paused, took a breath. "I know what happens when children are pulled away from home. I know what it feels like to sit in a stranger's living room and be told this is your new home now. I know what it feels like when no one fights for you." She looked straight into the judge's eyes. "And I will not let that happen to these 2 children." Silence. The judge looked at Marin, looked at the records, looked at Ginevra. "Mrs. Holt," he said, "do you wish to challenge the financial records Mrs. Calloway has just presented?" Ginevra looked at her lawyer. The lawyer looked at the records, then looked down, said nothing. Ginevra opened her mouth, closed it, then said, "That is my personal matter, and has nothing to do with my ability to raise my grandchildren. It has direct bearing on the motive behind this petition, Mrs. Holt," the judge said. He closed the file. "The court denies the petition for transfer of guardianship. Custody remains with Mr. Reed Calloway." Marin heard the words, but it took several seconds for them to sink in. Then they reached her. She had won. She had actually won. Ginevra stood, her face drained white, turned, and walked out without looking at anyone. Her lawyer followed, briefcase closed, moving quickly behind her. Marin remained seated for another minute. Her legs were shaking. Her hands were shaking, but her back stayed straight. She stood, picked up the file case, and walked out of the courtroom. The courthouse hallway was wide and empty. Sunlight poured through the glass at the far end of the corridor, so bright it almost hurt her eyes. Marin walked toward that light, one step at a time, her legs still trembling, but never stopping. Marin pushed through the glass doors of the courthouse and stepped outside. The March sunlight hit her face at once, bright and cold, the kind of Chicago early spring light that dazzled without ever truly warming. She stopped on the steps, drew in a long breath, and felt the cold air fill her lungs like water filling an empty glass. It was over. She had won. Her legs were still shaking, but she started down the stairs anyway, one step at a time, her hand gripping the file case tightly. She thought about the penthouse, about Reed waiting, about the children, about the call she would make to tell them. She thought about too many things. So she didn't see the man blocking the bottom of the stairs until she was almost upon him. He wore a black coat and leaned against a concrete pillar, one hand in his pocket, his face calm, the kind of man you would walk past without a second glance if he hadn't stepped directly into Marin's path. "Mrs. Calloway," he said. His voice was light, polite, like a man asking for directions. "Mr. Marchetti sent a message. Next time, don't dig into things that aren't yours." Marin stopped. Her heart started beating faster, but her face didn't change. She had lived long enough in this kind of world to know that looking afraid was the same as losing. "I don't know any Mr. Marchetti," she said. "He knows you." The man smiled, the kind of smile that never reached the eyes. "And he wants you to know that there are lines you shouldn't cross, for the sake of your health." Marin opened her mouth to say something, But she never got the chance. Because another figure appeared. From behind the man. From the thin crowd scattered across the courthouse steps. Footsteps even. Back straight. Eyes fixed on one single point. Reed Calloway stepped into the sunlight as though he had been there from the beginning. And he had been there from the beginning. Marin understood it instantly. He wasn't at home. He was at the courthouse, sitting in the back row, in the last seat, where she hadn't seen him. He had heard her speak before the judge, had heard her talk about foster care, had heard her fight for his family with everything she had. Reed didn't look at Marin. He looked at Marchetti's man. He walked forward, stopped between her and the other man, and stood there. He didn't speak at once. He only stood there, and the weight of his presence alone was enough to thicken the air around them. Marchetti's man recognized Reed. Marin saw it in his eyes, that moment of recognition, then calculation, then the realization that he had just made a mistake. "Tell Marchetti," Reed said, his voice low, each word falling slow and heavy. "If he touches her, I come to him." He didn't shout. He didn't threaten with volume. Just 7 words, spoken in the same tone a man might use to order a meal. But everyone listening understood that this wasn't an empty threat. The man looked at Reed, looked at Marin, then he pulled his hand from his pocket, nodded once, turned, and walked away. Not fast, not running, but not daring to go slowly either. Reed stayed where he was, until the man disappeared around the corner. Then he turned to Marin. She looked at him. "I thought you were at home," she said. "I thought you didn't need anyone to protect you." Marin looked at him for another second. The man who had spent 3 years hiding inside his own penthouse, who had declared this marriage was only paperwork, who had said she was the only one who agreed as though she had been the last thing left on a shelf. That man had driven to the courthouse, sat in the last row, listened as she fought without saying a word, then stepped forward when she needed him. Not because of a contract, not because of duty. "I don't need anyone to protect me," Marin said. "But thank you." Reed looked at her, and for the first time, on the face she had watched for 3 months without ever fully reading, everything was clear. Not a wall, not a window cracked open, a door thrown wide. He stepped closer. 1 step. His hand rose and touched her face, lightly, his fingers brushing her cheek as though she were something precious he was afraid of breaking. Then he kissed her. On the steps of the Cook County Courthouse, in broad daylight, in the middle of Chicago. The kiss wasn't rushed, wasn't clumsy. Gentle and certain at the same time, the way Reed did everything. Controlled but real. Marin stood still for 1 second. Then she kissed him back. Her hand let go of the file case. It fell onto the courthouse step, and she didn't care. She kissed him back not because of the contract, not because of gratitude, not because he had just placed himself between her and danger, but because she wanted to. Because in the 3 months she had lived inside Reed Calloway's fortress, Marin had found something she had never gone looking for, and she didn't want to let it go. They pulled apart after a few seconds. Reed bent down, picked up the file case, brushed off the dust, and handed it back to her. "Shall we go home?" he asked. "Home. Not the penthouse, not the apartment. Home." Marin took the file case, looked at him, and nodded. "Let's go home." That night, after the children were asleep and the penthouse had sunk into silence, Reed found Marin in the kitchen. She was washing glasses, not because they needed washing, but because her hands needed something to do so they would stop shaking. The adrenaline from the court hearing still hadn't fully left her system. Reed stood in the kitchen doorway, one shoulder resting against the frame, watching her. Marin turned off the water and faced him. "I love you," he said. No preface, no careful lead-in. 3 words, set down in the empty kitchen, with more weight than any contract he had ever signed. Marin stood still. The dish towel was still in her hand. "I don't know since when," Reed went on. "Maybe from the night you sat on the hallway floor and refused to go to sleep. Maybe from the moment you drove Ginevra Holt out of the house with a single question. Maybe even before that." He stepped into the kitchen and stopped 2 paces away from her. "But today, when I sat in the last row of that courtroom and heard you tell the judge that you wouldn't let anyone take the children away from their home, I knew. And when Marchetti's man stood in front of you outside the courthouse, I knew it even more clearly. Losing you would be losing everything." Marin set the towel down. "You have 2 children. And I have you." Reed looked at her, his eyes no longer flat, no longer hiding, fully open now for the first time. "You're the one holding it all together. Not the contract. Not the money. You. Maren didn't answer with words. She stepped forward, closed the last 2 steps between them, and placed her hand against his chest, right over his heartbeat. He put his hand over hers, held it there. They stood in the kitchen in silence, and it was all that needed to be said. 2 months later, Ginevra Holt returned to the penthouse. This time she didn't force her way in. She called first. Her voice on the phone sounded different from every other time Maren had heard it. Thinner, more tired, like a string stretched too long. Maren let her come up. When the elevator opened, Maren almost didn't recognize her. Ginevra had grown noticeably thinner. Her coat hung looser than before, her collarbones visible beneath the neckline. She wore no makeup, no pearls, no diamonds. In her hands she carried a small leather-bound notebook, old, with worn corners. "I didn't come to make trouble," Ginevra said. Her voice was soft now, without the sharp edge it had carried before. "I came to return this." She placed the notebook on the table. Noelle's journal. The real one. Maren looked at the journal, then at Ginevra. "My daughter wrote that she loved Reed," Ginevra said, her eyes lowered to the notebook as though it weighed more than $8 million. She knew who he was, knew what his work was, knew the risks, and she still chose to stay. Every day, every page. I read it again and again, for 2 months, and I couldn't accept it. Couldn't accept that my daughter had chosen that road for herself. She stopped, took a breath. "But looking at you," she said, lifting her eyes to Maren, "I understand why. You're like Noelle too. You know what you're standing inside, and you stay anyway." Maren said nothing. She didn't need to. "I'm sorry," Ginevra said. "Not because I filed the petition, but because I used my grandchildren as weapons." She stood. "Take care of them. Better than I ever did." Then she left. The elevator doors closed. Maren picked up the journal and went to find Reed in his study. He was reading something, but he looked up the moment she entered. She placed the notebook on his desk. "Ginevra was here. This is Noelle's journal, the real one." Reed looked at the journal, didn't touch it, for a long time. Then he reached out, lifted it, and opened the first page. Maren saw his hand trembling, only slightly, but trembling. She turned, about to leave and give him space. "Stay," he said, without looking up. So she stayed, stood by the window while Reed read his late wife's journal in silence. He didn't cry. But when he closed the notebook, his eyes were different, as though someone had just loosened the final knot in the rope he had tied around his chest for 3 years. "She was happy," he said softly. "She was truly happy." Maren nodded. Nothing more needed to be said. That afternoon, Maren was sitting at the kitchen table reviewing the adoption papers for her 2 younger siblings when she heard light footsteps behind her. Tessa. The girl had fully recovered now, color back in her cheeks, light back in her eyes, and she still carried a book everywhere as an old habit. Tessa didn't say anything at first. She pulled out a chair, sat down beside Maren at the kitchen table, placed her book on the surface, and looked out the window. "You know," Tessa said quietly, "my mom used to sit here too." Maren stopped what she was doing, looked at Tessa. The girl wasn't sad. She was simply remembering. The kind of remembering that had become gentle, no longer painful, only warm. "I think my mom would have liked you," Tessa said. "Because you're as stubborn as she was." Maren laughed. The sound came out naturally, without thinking. And Tessa laughed too. For the first time since Maren had entered the penthouse, the girl laughed for real. Not a polite smile, not a careful little expression, but the kind of laugh only children who are beginning to trust can give. That night, before bed, Josie ran into the living room and hugged Maren, her little arms wrapped around Maren's waist, her face pressed into the fabric of her shirt, her voice muffled. "You're my family now, right?" Maren placed a hand on Josie's head and stroked gently. "That's right, sweetheart." Josie squeezed tighter for 1 second more. Then she let go, grinned from ear to ear, and ran back to her room with Captain tucked beneath her arm. Maren stood there, watching her go, and felt something warm inside her chest. Not a racing heartbeat, not adrenaline. Belonging, the feeling she had searched for during 27 years and had never found until now. The first anniversary of their wedding fell on a Saturday morning at the end of November. Chicago was wrapped in a thin mist, the kind that would vanish as soon as the sun rose. But at 6 o'clock in the morning, looking through the glass, The whole city seemed draped in a white veil. Maren woke and saw Reed sitting at the edge of the bed. It wasn't unusual anymore. For the past few months, he had been sleeping in her room, on the right side of the hallway, the place she had once walked into alone a year ago, with bare feet and a hardened heart. Now the room on the left side of the hallway stood empty. "You're up," she said, her voice still thick with sleep. "I have something for you." Reed held out a small box, not a velvet jewelry box, a worn wooden one, the lid lightly scratched, the kind of box that had passed through more than one lifetime. Maren sat up and opened it. Inside was a ring. Simple, gold dulled by time, no stone, no elaborate design. But when she turned it over, there was a word engraved inside the band. "Stay." "My grandmother's ring," Reed said. "She gave it to my grandfather the day he was about to leave. Leave the house. Leave the family. Leave Chicago." She didn't argue, didn't try to hold him back. She just gave him the ring and said, "Just stay. We'll figure out the rest." Maren looked at the ring, looked at the word "stay," the engraving worn but still clear. "Did your grandfather stay?" she asked. "He stayed, and rebuilt everything from the ground up." Reed took the ring from her hand and slipped it onto the ring finger of her left hand, beside the wedding band she had worn for a year, the contract ring. Now it had a companion. "I'm not good with words," Reed said. "You know that. But I want you to know that I'm not going anywhere. And you don't have to go either." Maren turned the ring slowly on her finger. It fit, as though it had been waiting for her all these years. "I'm not going anywhere," she said, and she meant it. That afternoon, a car pulled up in front of the building. Maren stood in the lobby, her hands clasped tightly together, her heart racing in a way no courtroom, no long night, no confrontation had ever made it race before. The car door opened. 2 children stepped out. The older one was 9 years old, the younger 6. Maren hadn't seen them in nearly 4 months since the adoption paperwork had been finalized. 4 months of waiting for documents, for social services, for a judge's signature. The longest 4 months of her life. The younger one saw Maren first. His eyes widened. Then he ran. Straight across the lobby. Straight into her. Arms wrapping tight around her as though afraid she might disappear again. The older one walked more slowly, but came too. And Maren held them both. Held tight. Held long. Held as though the world could collapse and she still wouldn't let go. Upstairs, Tessa and Josie were waiting by the elevator. Josie bounced on her feet, too excited to stand still. When the doors opened and the 2 children stepped out, Josie immediately grabbed the younger child's hand. "Come on, I'll show you your room. It's really nice. There's a window that looks out over the lake." The 2 children followed Josie, still shy, but smiling. Tessa stayed behind. She looked at Maren, at the 4 children chattering as they walked down the hallway, then back at her. "Our house is crowded now," Tessa said. Maren smiled. "Our house is just right." Tessa nodded. Then she turned and followed the others, and Maren heard her voice drifting back. "Captain stays in Josie's room. Okay, don't take him. He gets jealous." Laughter echoed down the hallway. Maren stood there, listening, and felt something break open inside her chest. Not the kind of breaking that hurt, the kind that opened. Like the last door had just been unlocked after 27 years. Reed stood at the living room doorway, his back against the frame, his hands in his pockets, the same posture as always. But his eyes were different. He looked at Maren, at the 4 children running back and forth, at the penthouse that a year ago had been cold and empty like a museum. Now it held laughter. Mrs. Blackwell stood beside him. She watched the scene, her arms folded, her lips pressed together in the way Maren had learned meant she was trying not to smile. "She changed this entire house, Mrs. Blackwell said softly, just loud enough for Reed to hear. Reed looked at Maren. She was sitting on the living room floor, her 2 siblings beside her. Josie introducing Captain to the younger child, Tessa sitting on the sofa with a book but her eyes drifting down to the group at her feet with a quiet smile. 6 months ago, that living room had been where Maren sat alone at midnight, her back against the glass, wondering what she was doing there. Now it was home. "No," Reed said. "She saved this entire house. Maren Cole had once had nothing. No home, no family, no one who chose to stay for her. But she had built everything herself. And no one could take away what she had fought to keep. If this story stayed with you until the very last moment, Take a second to press like so more people can hear it. Share this with someone who needs a story worth thinking about, and subscribe so you don't miss the next one. What did you feel about Marin's story? Leave a comment from the heart. We read every word. Thank you for being here. Wishing you and your family health, happiness, and peace every day. Goodbye, and see you in the next story.